Good evening. I'm your epistemology professor, and I'm sure you're all wondering why I'm speaking to you this evening. I want to talk to you tonight about a matter of grave importance for our studying epistemology together. You know, sometimes when we come into something like a philosophy class or something like that, where a humanities class or social science class, where we might not be sure about what it is that we're studying because we're new to it. We don't understand the concepts very well, and we're not familiar with sort of collective conversation very well. But one thing that a lot of us have are political opinions. People have other kinds of universalizing opinions. Some people will bring, for example, their religious attitudes to class, which I'm not criticizing that. I'm just pointing things out right now, just facts of life. And we'll tend to interpret things in those kinds of colors, or ask, maybe if you have a serious devotional practice in your life, you can ask, well, what is this material saying? And I can figure out whether I like it or not. But one way that people do that in the college, even more frequently, is by using their political orientation to try and get a handle on the material. Because, after all, and it's only fair. I mean, if you're looking for if you're looking for an in, you want some traction, you want to get a handle on some things a little bit and understand where it is. And what you really want is up or down. And actually that notion of sort of thumbs up or thumbs down is really important, I think, in philosophy or any abstract material that you're having that is difficult to understand, let's just say. Because you might not understand it entirely, but you can get a sort of feeling of thumbs up or thumbs down. Do I like the sound of this or do I not? I don't understand it very well. It's fairly complicated, or at least it seems like it is. But do I get a good feeling from it or not? And that's valid and legitimate because that gives you a little bit of traction, puts you in a little bit of a position you can start from there to explore. Doesn't mean you won't change your mind. You might change your mind. So then what happens is that most of us have some sort of fairly good political orientation, or at least a lot of people in college do. I know I do. And we bring that along and we think, well, I know what my political sort of orientation is. And so show me, where the good guys are and the bad guys are on that. And I'll sort of make up my mind, I'll get to work. I'm a good soldier and all that kind of stuff. But in epistemology, that's really a mistake. And as I say, I mean, in terms of sort of appealing to you as, representatives of the epistemological nation, I just wanted to make the point. I'm only going to make the point tonight for, this is only going to be about 10 minutes or so long, much shorter than what I'm usually doing these days. Oops. And that is that politics and epistemology are orthogonal. That is the message of the day. It's also the word of the day, isn't it? Orthogonal. So what I want people to understand coming out in the future, this will always be the first one on the epistemology playlist of the YouTube videos. Because this is something that people should get right off the bat. So orthogonal lines intersect at right angles, as you can see there. Those are orthogonal lines. There's XY graphs, like in calculus, like in trigonometry, and like in the representation of all kinds of information and graphs, as you know. And so that's just very simple what we mean by orthogonal. So you take one of those, say you take the horizontal line and call it the political pole, and you take the vertical line, you can call that the epistemological pole. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about, I mean, that is the most important thing that I would tell you. I think just pointing that out is really enough, but I want to work out with it a little bit more. So for one thing, it's defining those poles. Well, let's get to that. What's the implication really of saying that politics and epistemology are orthogonal? Well, what that means is that there are 4 possibility quadrants. There are 4 theoretical possibility spaces where you might look for a position, a coherent position, based on where it stood in relation to the 2 orthogonal poles, as you can see in the example with pluses and minuses there on the graph. That is, you get some depth. Notice you can also get a two-dimensional representation with 8 sectors, cube sectors, pretty easy. So it's talking about, again, representations of positions. It's just a medium to represent things. Although the point that I'm making is certainly a conceptual point, the point that I want to make for when you're thinking about epistemology. So this is kind of a mess. I just made it now. The main problem was finding a pen that had a hard enough line. Epistemology and politics. So orthogonal. Let's just look at a couple of, this is just for examples. Like I say, this is just a provisional me thinking out loud. The epistemological poles. I have put there objectivist and subjectivist. What exactly does that mean? Is subjectivist the same thing as relativist? I'm not entirely sure it is, but I don't know. There are two different concepts that need looking at. Objectivism, I put metaphysical realism there. As an empiricist, I'm not a metaphysical realist, but I think of myself more as an objectivist than as a subjectivist. It gets complicated because of this idea about experience. And also the other thing for me is I'm against, as you know by now, mental representation. I don't think those theories. I think there's a big problem with representational theories of mind. Notice on the subjectivist pole, the upper of the epistemological pole, I have instrumentalist coherentist theories of truth, because those ones, notice you don't need a representational theory of mind. Is my position coherent on this graph here? Nah, not especially. This is just shagging flies. Notice, okay, a couple of specific things, and then we'll just be done. Upper right-hand quadrant, I have Plato's tyrant. Plato's tyrant, as described in Book 8 of the Republic there. See, Plato's tyrant is driven entirely by his own desires. He's a slave to his own cycle of craving and satisfaction. So he's as subjectivistic as you can get. He is the tyrant, so it is an authoritarian state of affairs. And I put something like national fascism, again, to the extent, I guess, to the extent that fascism or any kind of nationalism wants to claim that there's an irrational factor that actually outweighs what we might call more rational factors, like blood and soil kind of Nazi arguments. Then, for example, on the upper left-hand quadrant there, I have Sartre and existentialism, because they sort of say that the mind is kind of an annihilating no thing, not a thing. So that looks to me to not, that's not going to be authoritarian. It's certainly not going to be objectivist. What else could we talk about here? Theocracies are definitely going to be, right, aren't they going to be authoritarian and objectivist? And this is what people think of themselves. Notice a funny thing about this too, with these kinds of charts, and I think this is true in those charts, those quizzes where they graph you politically, like on the social media. I think in a funny way, these graphs show what these people think about themselves, I think. Enlightenment Republican, social contract, yeah. Although I think maybe Rousseau might object to being in the lower left and the upper left-hand quadrant. And I'm not sure that the later utilitarians like Mill are, well, Bentham looks to me to be a subjectivist, since he just wants to measure hedons in a sort of generic way. Well, anyway, that's just, like I say, I just sort of wrote that out before making this, because I just wanted to make the point. You sort of see how it goes. Last thing I'd say, looking at this little scratch here, Berkeley, remember Berkeley says that weird thing about, why don't you just get rid of the physical and say everything's mental? Where does he come up with that? Well, one way of looking at his thinking is he sees this theoretical possibility space that no one has explored. And I think there are a number of interesting philosophers who we can see them sort of doing that. Okay, so so then what's another the main takeaway, and I think the one that does all the work and everything else I would want to say unfolds from it automatically. It's just that epistemology and politics are orthogonal to each other. The corollary of that, I think, is this, that doing epistemology, whatever that is, you're doing epistemology, we're all doing epistemology when we are asking the question, to what extent are our mental contents constrained and imposed by the external world and objective facts? To what extent are we constrained to think the things that we do? And or on the opposite end, to what extent is the mind plastic? Well, how plastic is the mind? What kinds of programs? I mean, how different of a conceptual scheme do you really think that your brain could harbor, other than the one that it does? So for example, I would say politically, I'm to the left of Stalin, but epistemologically, I'm small c conservative. I mean, I'm a teacher and I don't like a lot of relativistic, nihilistic, Grateful Dead relativism. You believe what you believe, and I believe. I got to slap the students around about that. You're doing epistemology when you're asking the question about foundationalism versus constructivism, about objectivism versus subjectivism, or whatever other concepts you want to use. And it's important to look at those concepts. That's what doing epistemology is. It's an activity. You don't have to keep doing it. You don't even ever have to do it at all if you don't want. I don't take myself that seriously, but look, but for what it's worth, I mean, if you want to do epistemology, what epistemology is asking a question about sort of the plasticity versus the necessity, the contingency versus necessity of knowledge, your power as a knower. And the other video, I mean, I'm not going to do any links with this one. This is just a short thing of exhortation. This is an exhortation. But I'm this week. Well, I'll also do the virtue epistemology video. So this is the kind of things that we're thinking about this week. All right, so really, that is about it. But I want you to know that the administration of our epistemology seminar considers these matters of grave importance and takes any political statement as something to run away from as quickly as possible. All right, I'll see you next week.